The incredible story I'm about to tell you today began on a humid Thursday morning in late August, precisely at 5:45 in the morning, when most of the city was still sleeping and the streets were nearly empty except for delivery trucks and early morning workers rushing to their jobs, when Eduardo Santos stood outside his luxurious penthouse apartment building, waiting impatiently for his personal driver who was running 7 minutes late, which was completely unacceptable according to Eduardo's rigid standards of punctuality and professional conduct that he expected from everyone who worked for him, regardless of circumstances or extenuating factors. Eduardo was a 47-year-old self-made millionaire who had built a massive real estate development empire from absolutely nothing, starting as a poor construction worker who mixed cement and carried bricks in the scorching sun for 12 hours a day, earning barely enough to survive. And through decades of ruthless determination, calculated risk-taking, occasional moral compromises that he preferred not to think about too carefully, and an almost superhuman work ethic that left no room for personal relationships or leisure time, he had transformed himself into one of the wealthiest and most powerful businessmen in the entire metropolitan region, with a property portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars and political connections that extended all the way to the national capital. His personal driver, Ricardo, had been with him for almost 6 years. A reliable middle-aged man who knew Eduardo's demanding schedule perfectly, who understood without being told that conversation during morning drives was unwelcome because Eduardo needed that time to review documents and make important phone calls and prepare mentally for the brutal day of meetings and negotiations and decisions that lay ahead, who kept the luxury sedan impeccably clean and maintained, and who had never once in 6 years been late for a scheduled pickup until this morning, when he apparently decided that Eduardo's time and schedule were somehow less important than whatever personal drama or excuse had caused this unforgivable delay. Eduardo stood on the sidewalk checking his expensive Swiss watch every 30 seconds, his jaw clenched with irritation and his mind already composing the harsh lecture he would deliver to Ricardo about responsibility and respect, and the fact that there were thousands of unemployed people who would be grateful for this high-paying position and would actually show up on time like professionals, instead of treating their employer's schedule as optional. When a black luxury sedan that looked identical to Ricardo's usual vehicle finally pulled up to the curb at 5:52, 7 full minutes late, Eduardo yanked open the back door, prepared to launch immediately into his prepared speech about unacceptable behavior and final warnings and the need to find a new driver who actually valued this position. But the words died in his throat when he looked at the person sitting in the driver's seat and realized with shock and confusion that it absolutely was not Ricardo at all, but rather a woman he had never seen before in his entire life. A young woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s with dark curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, warm brown eyes that held intelligence and determination, and an expression of professional composure that seemed only slightly undermined by obvious nervousness about meeting her new employer for the very first time under less than ideal circumstances. Eduardo stood frozen, with his hand still on the door handle, staring at this complete stranger who was sitting in his driver's seat as if she belonged there, and his first thought was that someone had made a terrible mistake, or that he had gotten into the wrong car, despite the fact that the license plate clearly matched Ricardo's vehicle and all the interior details were exactly as they should be. The young woman turned in her seat to face Eduardo fully and spoke in a clear, professional voice that betrayed only the slightest tremor of anxiety as she introduced herself as Lucia Fernandez and explained that she was his new driver starting today, and that the agency had informed her just yesterday evening that she would be taking over this route permanently because the previous driver, Ricardo, had resigned suddenly due to a family emergency that required him to move immediately to another state to care for his elderly mother who had suffered a serious stroke. Eduardo processed this information with growing anger, not at Lucia specifically, but at the situation and the complete lack of consideration shown by Ricardo, who hadn't even had the basic courtesy to give proper notice or to inform Eduardo directly about his departure, and at the agency that had sent a replacement driver without consulting him first or giving him any opportunity to interview and approve this person who would now be spending significant time in close proximity to him every single day and who would have access to confidential conversations and information about his business dealings and schedule. Eduardo got into the back seat without saying a word to Lucia, beyond a curt acknowledgement of her introduction, immediately pulling out his phone and his laptop and making it absolutely clear through his body language and pointed silence that he had no interest in small talk or getting-to-know-you conversation with this new employee who had been thrust upon him without warning or consultation. Lucia started driving smoothly and professionally, her hands confident on the steering wheel, her attention focused completely on the road and traffic, clearly understanding without being told that this was not an employer who welcomed chatty drivers or appreciated unsolicited opinions or commentary. The drive to Eduardo's first meeting location proceeded in tense silence, broken only by the sounds of Eduardo typing aggressively on his laptop keyboard and occasionally muttering irritably under his breath when emails contained information he didn't want to hear or when traffic moved slower than his impatient nature could tolerate. Over the following days and weeks, this uncomfortable pattern continued, with Eduardo maintaining cold professional distance from Lucia and making absolutely no effort to acknowledge her as a human being rather than simply a service provider whose only value lay in her ability to transport him efficiently from point A to point B without errors or delays or any attempt at personal connection. Lucia, for her part, handled this treatment with remarkable grace and professionalism, never complaining about Eduardo's coldness or demanding treatment, never making comments about his rudeness or lack of basic courtesy, never trying to force conversation or break through the walls he had so clearly erected. She simply did her job impeccably, arriving exactly on time every single morning without fail, keeping the vehicle spotlessly clean and perfectly maintained, navigating traffic skillfully to minimize delays, and learning quickly all of Eduardo's preferences and routines, including his preferred routes, his favorite coffee stop for those rare mornings when he wanted to pick something up on the way, the fact that he liked the temperature set to exactly 21 degrees Celsius, no warmer or cooler, and the reality that the morning drive was sacred quiet time, while afternoon drives home might occasionally allow for brief necessary exchanges of information about schedule changes or upcoming appointments. What Eduardo didn't know and couldn't have guessed, based on his complete lack of interest in Lucia as a person rather than just a function, was that she had an extraordinary background and story that would have fascinated him if he had bothered to ask even a single personal question or show the slightest curiosity about who this young woman actually was beyond her job title. Lucia had graduated at the top of her class from one of the most prestigious business schools in the country with a degree in finance and entrepreneurship, had worked for 3 years at a major international bank in their corporate investment division, and had been on a clear track toward a successful, high-powered career in the financial sector with all the status and compensation and impressive titles that path would have provided. But 2 years ago, her life had been completely upended when her younger brother Diego, who was only 17 years old, had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of leukemia that required immediate intensive treatment, including chemotherapy and eventually a bone marrow transplant if a suitable donor could be found. The treatment was devastatingly expensive even with the basic health insurance their family had, and Lucia's parents, who ran a small neighborhood grocery store, were financially devastated within months by the mounting medical bills and the need to close their store temporarily so they could focus all their time and energy on caring for Diego through the brutal treatment process. Lucia had made the difficult decision to leave her promising career in finance and take whatever job she could find that paid well and offered flexible hours so she could help support her family financially while also being available to spend time with Diego during his hospitalization and recovery periods when he needed family present to maintain his spirits and will to fight through the pain and exhaustion of treatment. She had worked as a driver for the past year and a half, not because it was her dream career or passion, but because it paid decently, and the hours were predictable, and it left her mental energy free to focus on her family crisis, rather than demanding all her intellectual and emotional resources the way her previous high-stress banking position had required. Diego had eventually received his bone marrow transplant and was now in the recovery and monitoring phase, where doctors were cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis, though he still needed regular checkups and blood tests and careful attention to any signs of complications or relapse. Lucia's goal was to save enough money over the next year or two to help her family recover financially from the devastating medical expenses they had accumulated, to ensure her parents could reopen their store and stabilize their own situation, and then eventually to return to her career in finance or possibly start her own business consulting firm, helping small companies with financial planning and strategy. She was intelligent, ambitious, capable, resilient, and remarkably mature for her age. But Eduardo knew absolutely none of this, because he had never asked a single question about her background or life or aspirations or challenges, had never shown even the most minimal human curiosity about who was driving him around the city for hours every day. The first crack in Eduardo's wall of indifference came about 6 weeks after Lucia started working as his driver, on a particularly stressful afternoon when Eduardo emerged from a disastrous meeting where a major development deal he had been working on for 18 months had suddenly collapsed due to political complications and local community opposition that his team had failed to anticipate or manage properly. He was in an absolutely foul mood, slamming the car door harder than necessary when he got in, cursing viciously under his breath about incompetent employees and corrupt politicians and ignorant protesters who didn't understand economics or progress, making phone calls where he yelled at various subordinates and threatened terminations and demanded answers and solutions that nobody could reasonably provide in the moment. Lucia drove in her usual professional silence through increasingly heavy traffic, and Eduardo's frustration and rage continued building as construction delays and an accident on the highway meant they were crawling along at walking pace, instead of making reasonable progress toward his next appointment. Finally, Eduardo exploded in anger, slamming his fist on the armrest and shouting at Lucia that this was completely unacceptable, and that surely she could have chosen a different route or anticipated this delay somehow, and why hadn't she been monitoring traffic conditions more carefully, and this was exactly the kind of incompetence he couldn't tolerate. It was completely unfair and irrational to blame Lucia for circumstances entirely outside her control, and Eduardo knew this even as the words were coming out of his mouth. But his anger and stress needed an outlet, and she was conveniently available as a target for his displaced rage. Instead of responding defensively or arguing back or even showing visible signs of hurt or offense, Lucia simply pulled the car over to the side of the highway, put on the hazard lights, and turned in her seat to face Eduardo directly with an expression that was calm and professional, but also remarkably firm and self-possessed for someone who was being yelled at by her wealthy and powerful employer. Lucia spoke in a voice that was quiet, but absolutely steady and clear. And she said something that nobody had dared to say to Eduardo in many years because most people were either too afraid of his power and temper or too dependent on his money and approval to risk contradicting him directly. She told him with perfect composure that she understood he was having a difficult day and that the traffic situation was frustrating for both of them, but that yelling at her and blaming her for circumstances beyond anyone's control was neither fair nor productive, and that if he was going to continue working with her as his driver, then they needed to establish some basic ground rules about respectful communication, regardless of stress levels or bad moods or professional disappointments. She said that she took pride in doing her job well, and that she genuinely tried to anticipate problems and find solutions, but that she wasn't a miracle worker who could control traffic patterns or predict accidents or make highways magically clear themselves during rush hour. She added that she had worked with many many demanding employers in various capacities throughout her career, and she understood that high-stress positions came with emotional volatility sometimes, but that taking out frustrations on service providers who were doing their best was a choice, not a necessity, and she would appreciate if he could make a different choice going forward. Eduardo sat completely stunned and speechless for several long moments, because absolutely nobody spoke to him that way. Nobody pushed back or set boundaries or suggested that he needed to modify his behavior rather than expecting everyone around him to simply tolerate whatever treatment he chose to dish out, regardless of how inappropriate or hurtful it might be. His first instinct was anger at this presumption and insubordination from someone he could fire with a single phone call. But underneath that automatic defensive reaction was something else that surprised him. A grudging respect for someone who had the courage and self-respect to stand up to him calmly and assert her own dignity rather than just accepting abuse silently. He found himself actually listening to her words and recognizing the truth in them, acknowledging internally, if not yet verbally, that she was absolutely right and that he had been unreasonable and unfair in his outburst. After a long, awkward silence, during which Lucia waited patiently for whatever response Eduardo would choose to offer, Eduardo finally cleared his throat and said something that probably hadn't crossed his lips in years in any genuine context. He said simply and without elaborate justification or defensive excuses, "You're right. I apologize for taking my frustration out on you. That was inappropriate and you didn't deserve that treatment." Lucia's expression softened slightly and she nodded in acknowledgement of his apology, then turned back around and carefully merged back into traffic to continue their journey. Something had shifted fundamentally in that moment, though neither of them could have articulated exactly what it was or predicted how that shift would continue to grow and develop over the coming weeks and months. From that day forward, Eduardo became slightly more conscious of how he interacted with Lucia, making small efforts to modulate his tone and avoid displacing stress onto her, occasionally even offering brief thanks when she handled a complicated traffic situation skillfully or found a creative route around construction delays. For her part, Lucia began occasionally offering unsolicited observations or suggestions about logistics or scheduling when she noticed patterns that Eduardo might not have been aware of given his focus on bigger picture business concerns. She might mention that morning traffic was particularly bad on certain routes on Mondays due to school schedules and suggest adjusting departure times slightly to avoid the worst congestion, or she might point out that a particular coffee shop he liked had opened a second location closer to his office that might be more convenient for morning stops. These were small practical contributions that went beyond the basic job description of just driving, and Eduardo found himself actually appreciating this proactive problem-solving approach rather than finding it presumptuous or annoying. The real turning point in their relationship came approximately 3 months after Lucia had started working for Eduardo, on an evening when Eduardo was heading home later than usual after a particularly long day of back-to-back meetings and difficult negotiations that had left him mentally and emotionally exhausted. As they were driving through a neighborhood that was decidedly less affluent than the areas where Eduardo typically spent his time, Lucia suddenly slowed the car and pulled over near a small community center that had lights on and appeared to be hosting some kind of event. Eduardo looked up from his phone, where he had been scrolling through emails, and asked with obvious irritation why they were stopping since they weren't at his destination yet, and he hadn't requested any stops. Lucia apologized quickly and explained that her younger brother was inside that community center, attending a support group meeting for young cancer survivors and their families, and she just wanted to pop in for literally 2 minutes to check on him and make sure he didn't need anything before their mother picked him up later. Eduardo's first instinct was to refuse this request because it wasn't part of their agreed arrangement, and he didn't pay Lucia's salary to accommodate personal errands during work hours. But something made him pause before the harsh refusal left his lips. Maybe it was the genuine concern he could hear in Lucia's voice when she mentioned checking on her brother, Or maybe it was simple curiosity about the fact that she had a brother with medical issues, which was the first actual personal information he had learned about her life beyond work in 3 months of daily interaction. Or maybe it was just exhaustion making him less rigid than usual about schedules and protocols. Whatever the reason, instead of refusing flatly, Eduardo found himself saying something that surprised them both. He said that she could go check on her brother and that he would wait in the car, but then added impulsively that, actually, if she didn't mind, he would come inside with her because he was curious to see what these support group meetings were like, since he had donated money to various cancer charities over the years, but had never actually witnessed the real impact or understood what patients and families actually needed beyond generic fundraising appeals. Lucia looked genuinely surprised and pleased by this response, and she led Eduardo into the modest community center that was filled with folding chairs and inspirational posters on the walls, and a general atmosphere of warmth and mutual support that felt completely foreign to Eduardo, who spent most of his time in sterile corporate conference rooms or luxurious restaurants or exclusive clubs where everything was designed to impress rather than to comfort. The support group meeting was already underway, with about 20 people of various ages sitting in a circle sharing their experiences and challenges and victories related to cancer treatment and recovery. Lucia's brother Diego was easy to spot because he looked up immediately when they entered, and his entire face lit up with joy at seeing his sister, and Eduardo was struck by how young and vulnerable this teenager looked, despite clearly trying to project strength and normalcy with his bright smile and casual clothes that couldn't quite hide how thin he had become from treatment. Eduardo sat in a chair at the back of the room while Lucia went over to hug her brother and have a quick whispered conversation, and he found himself actually listening intently to the stories being shared by the group members rather than immediately pulling out his phone to continue working like he normally would in any situation where he had unexpected downtime. He heard a young mother talking about the terror of being diagnosed with breast cancer while pregnant and the impossible decisions about whether to start treatment immediately risking the baby or delay treatment risking her own life, and how she had ultimately survived through aggressive treatment and now had a healthy 4-year-old daughter, but lived with constant fear of recurrence. He heard an elderly man talking about being told he had only months to live from pancreatic cancer, but through experimental treatment and what he believed was divine intervention, he had been cancer-free for 2 years and was now dedicated to supporting others facing similar diagnoses. He heard Diego himself speaking in a young voice that tried to sound casual, but couldn't quite hide the underlying fear as he talked about finishing his treatment and being told the transplant was successful, but still having nightmares sometimes that the cancer would come back, and this time the doctors wouldn't be able to save him. Eduardo felt something cracking inside his chest as he listened to these stories of real human suffering and resilience and courage, as he witnessed the genuine compassion and support these strangers offered each other simply because they shared the common experience of having faced death and survived at least temporarily, as he recognized that every person in this modest community center had endured more genuine hardship and demonstrated more authentic strength than most of the wealthy, powerful people he interacted with daily, who thought closing a difficult business deal or navigating corporate politics constituted real adversity. When the meeting ended and people started getting up to get coffee and cookies from a table against the wall, several group members came over to thank Eduardo for attending, even though they had never seen him before, assuming he must be someone's family member or friend there for support. One older woman with a scarf covering her head where chemotherapy had taken her hair gripped Eduardo's hand warmly and told him that it meant so much when people showed up for these meetings because it reminded them they weren't alone and forgotten in their struggles, that the outside world still cared and saw them as human beings rather than just statistics or sob stories. Eduardo found himself deeply moved and uncomfortable in equal measure, moved by the genuine warmth and courage of these people who had every reason to be bitter and angry about their circumstances, but instead chose gratitude and connection, but uncomfortable because he recognized how completely self-absorbed and disconnected from real human suffering his own life had become. He had donated money to cancer research and hospitals over the years, always framing it as strategic philanthropy that would look good publicly and provide tax benefits. never actually thinking about the real people whose lives might be affected by that money, or considering that the parents and siblings and children of cancer patients might need support and resources just as much as the patients themselves. He thought about Lucia driving him around every day for months while quietly carrying the enormous burden of her brother's illness and her family's financial devastation, dealing with his rudeness and demands and complete indifference to her as a person, never complaining or asking for understanding or expecting any accommodation for the struggles she was managing outside of work hours. When Lucia finished talking with Diego and several other group members and indicated she was ready to leave, Eduardo followed her back out to the car in contemplative silence. As she started driving toward his apartment, Eduardo did something completely unprecedented in their entire working relationship. He asked her a personal question, specifically asking how long her brother had been sick, and whether the treatment was going well, and whether there was anything she needed in terms of schedule flexibility or other support to help manage the situation. Lucia looked startled by this sudden interest in her personal circumstances after months of studied indifference, but she answered honestly and openly, explaining Diego's diagnosis and treatment timeline and transplant and current recovery status, talking about the financial and emotional toll on her whole family, mentioning that she had left a promising career in finance to take this driving position because it offered better flexibility and less stress so she could focus energy on supporting her family through this crisis period. Eduardo listened with genuine attention and growing admiration for this young woman who had sacrificed her own career ambitions to care for her family, who showed up every single day with professionalism and competence, despite carrying burdens that would have crushed many people, who had never once complained or asked for special treatment, or used her difficult situation as an excuse for anything. He found himself asking more questions about her background and career and goals and family, actually curious now to understand who she really was beyond the function she performed in his life. And Lucia responded to this unexpected interest with cautious openness, sharing details about her business degree and banking experience and dreams of eventually starting her own consulting firm, about her parents' grocery store and the neighborhood where she had grown up, about her close relationship with Diego and her fierce determination to see him survive and thrive despite the cancer that had tried to claim his life. By the time they reached Eduardo's building, something fundamental had shifted between them from employer and service provider to something approaching actual human connection based on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other as complete people rather than just functions or roles. Eduardo found himself thinking about Lucia and her family's situation throughout the evening as he sat alone in his luxurious but empty apartment, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he had vastly more material wealth and resources than he could ever personally use, while people like Lucia and her family were struggling with devastating medical debt simply because they had the misfortune of loving someone who got seriously ill through no fault of their own. He thought about the fact that his monthly rent for this penthouse apartment that he barely spent time in and didn't particularly enjoy was probably more than Lucia's parents earned in 6 months running their small grocery store, that the cost of the custom suit he was wearing would likely cover several months of Diego's medications, that he regularly spent ridiculous amounts of money on business dinners and entertainment and luxury items he didn't need, while Lucia was driving him around, worried about whether her family would lose their store and home due to medical bankruptcy. Eduardo didn't sleep well that night, kept awake by thoughts and feelings he had successfully suppressed and avoided for years through constant work and purposeful emotional disconnection. He found himself remembering his own childhood growing up in poverty, his mother working multiple cleaning jobs to feed him and his 2 siblings, the fear and helplessness he had felt when his father left, and they had no stable income or security, the burning determination he had developed to escape poverty and never be vulnerable or powerless again. Somewhere along his journey from poor construction worker to wealthy real estate mogul, Eduardo had convinced himself that his success was purely the result of his own individual merit and effort, that poor people were poor because they didn't work hard enough or weren't smart enough or made bad choices. That wealth inequality was simply the natural order of things, reflecting differences in capability and determination, rather than reflecting systematic advantages and disadvantages that had little to do with individual virtue. Meeting Lucia and her family and seeing their situation up close had complicated that comfortable narrative and forced Eduardo to recognize that sometimes good, hard-working, intelligent people faced catastrophic circumstances completely beyond their control, and that the difference between success and failure sometimes had less to do with merit than with luck and circumstance and access to resources and support systems. The next morning, Eduardo surprised Lucia by asking her to stop at a coffee shop on the way to his first meeting, and when she pulled up, he invited her to come inside with him rather than just waiting in the car, saying he wanted to buy her breakfast since they needed to have a conversation about some changes to their working arrangement. Lucia looked understandably nervous about this unexpected departure from routine, but she followed him inside the cafe and sat across from him at a small table while he ordered coffee and pastries for both of them. Eduardo felt uncharacteristically awkward and uncertain about how to begin this conversation, but he finally just launched directly into what he wanted to say. He told Lucia that he had been thinking a lot about their interaction at the support group the previous evening and about everything he had learned about her situation and her brother's illness and her family's struggles. He said he had also been doing some reflection on his own attitudes and behavior and recognizing that he had been treating her poorly by being cold and dismissive and failing to acknowledge her as a complete human being rather than just a service provider. Eduardo continued by saying that he wanted to make some concrete changes to demonstrate genuine respect and support rather than just offering empty apologies. First, he was giving her an immediate substantial raise that would increase her salary by 40% effective immediately, not because her work quality had changed, but because he recognized she had been significantly underpaid relative to the value she provided and relative to his own absurd wealth. Second, he was adding full comprehensive health insurance coverage for her and her immediate family members at no cost to her, using his company's premium corporate plan that would cover any future medical expenses related to Diego's cancer treatment or other health issues. Third, he was making a direct, no-strings-attached financial gift to her parents to help them pay off their medical debts and provide capital to reopen their grocery store, because he wanted to help, but also because he recognized that having stable, financially secure parents would reduce pressure on Lucia and allow her to focus on her own goals and career. Lucia sat completely stunned and silent as Eduardo explained these changes, her eyes filling with tears that she tried unsuccessfully to blink back, clearly overwhelmed by this completely unexpected generosity from an employer who had shown her nothing but cold indifference for the previous 3 months. When Eduardo finished speaking, Lucia struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude and disbelief, but Eduardo cut her off gently and said that she didn't need to thank him excessively because this wasn't charity or a personal favor, but rather an attempt at basic fairness and human decency that he should have been demonstrating all along. He said that she had taught him something important simply by being consistently professional and maintaining her dignity and self-respect even when he was treating her poorly, and that meeting her brother and the support group had reminded him of realities about human vulnerability and suffering and mutual dependence that he had been avoiding and ignoring for far too long. Over the following weeks and months, the relationship between Eduardo and Lucia continued to evolve and deepen beyond employer-employee into something resembling genuine friendship based on mutual respect and increasingly honest communication about life and values and goals. Eduardo started actually engaging with Lucia in real conversations during their drives rather than treating her as invisible, asking her opinions on business questions, and being surprised and impressed by her sharp analytical mind and creative problem-solving abilities that had been developed during her finance career. Lucia started feeling comfortable enough to challenge Eduardo's thinking sometimes when she disagreed with his assumptions or approaches, often offering perspectives that he found genuinely valuable precisely because they came from someone with a completely different life experience and worldview than the wealthy executives and investors he normally consulted. A pivotal moment came when Eduardo learned through casual conversation that Lucia still harbored serious ambitions to eventually return to the finance industry or start her own business, and that she was taking online courses at night to maintain her skills and knowledge, even while working as a driver during the day. Eduardo immediately saw an opportunity to help, while also benefiting his own business interests, and he proposed that Lucia come work for his company directly in their financial planning and analysis department, where her education and experience would be valuable assets, and where she could work toward her longer-term career goals while still maintaining schedule flexibility to support her family. He offered a salary that was competitive with what she would have earned continuing in banking, along with benefits and opportunities for advancement and growth. Lucia was initially hesitant about accepting this offer because she worried it might be charity disguised as business and that she would be given a make-work position that didn't actually add value. But Eduardo assured her genuinely that he wouldn't insult her by offering a job she wasn't qualified for, and that he genuinely believed she could contribute meaningfully to his company, while also rebuilding her own career trajectory that had been interrupted by family crisis. Lucia accepted the position and proved within weeks that Eduardo's faith in her abilities was completely justified, as she quickly identified inefficiencies and opportunities in the company's financial operations and began implementing improvements that saved significant money and improved decision-making processes. Eduardo found himself relying increasingly on Lucia's analysis and advice, not just on routine financial matters, but on strategic decisions about which projects to pursue, how to structure deals, where to allocate resources for maximum impact and return. Her perspective as someone who had experienced both poverty and professional success, who understood numbers and strategy but also understood human needs and community impacts, brought a balance to Eduardo's thinking that had been sorely lacking when he was surrounded only by people whose primary concern was maximizing profit regardless of other considerations. As their professional relationship deepened, Eduardo and Lucia also began spending time together outside of work, initially just having occasional lunches where they would discuss business matters in a more relaxed setting, but gradually expanding to include dinners and weekend activities, and eventually Lucia inviting Eduardo to family gatherings at her parents' home, where he was welcomed with warmth and gratitude and treated as an honored guest, despite his wealth and status that might have created awkwardness or resentment. Eduardo found himself genuinely enjoying these interactions with Lucia's family, appreciating the warmth and authenticity and lack of pretense that characterized their relationships with each other, recognizing that they had something he had lost somewhere along his journey from poverty to wealth, which was the ability to find joy and meaning in simple human connection, rather than constantly striving for more achievement and accumulation. Approximately 1 year after that evening, when Eduardo had first accompanied Lucia into the community center support group meeting, Eduardo made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He announced that he was restructuring his business to focus less on maximizing profit from luxury real estate development that primarily benefited wealthy people, and more on creating affordable housing and community development projects that would actually help address the housing crisis affecting working families in the city. This wasn't pure altruism, since these projects would still be profitable just at lower margins than his previous ventures, but it represented a fundamental shift in values and priorities from purely financial optimization toward balancing profit with positive social impact. Many of Eduardo's longtime business associates and investors were skeptical or openly critical of this shift, warning that he was being naive and sentimental and that this approach would reduce his wealth and influence in the long run. But Eduardo found that he genuinely didn't care what they thought anymore because he had rediscovered something more important than their approval or his own ever-increasing net worth. The romantic dimension of Eduardo's relationship with Lucia developed gradually and naturally over that same year as their professional collaboration and personal friendship created a foundation of genuine understanding and respect and shared values that made the transition to romance feel inevitable rather than surprising or complicated. They had both been alone for years by choice. Eduardo because he had convinced himself that relationships were distractions from business success, and Lucia because her focus had been entirely on her brother's survival and her family's needs, leaving no emotional energy for dating or romance. But as they spent more time together and learned to trust each other completely and discovered how much they enjoyed each other's company and perspective, feelings began to develop that went beyond friendship or professional partnership into something deeper and more intimate, though neither rushed to label or define it prematurely. The moment when their relationship shifted explicitly from friendship to romance came during a business trip they took together to visit a potential development site in a smaller city several hours away. They had separate hotel rooms, of course, and maintained complete professionalism during all business meetings and site visits. But that evening, they had dinner together at a small restaurant and ended up talking for hours about topics far beyond business, including their hopes and fears and past disappointments and what they each wanted from life going forward. As they walked back toward the hotel through quiet streets under a clear, starry sky, Eduardo impulsively reached for Lucia's hand, and she intertwined her fingers with his without hesitation or awkwardness. And they walked in comfortable silence, just enjoying the simple physical connection and the peaceful companionship of being together without any need to perform or impress or maintain professional boundaries. That night marked the beginning of a romantic relationship that eventually led to Eduardo proposing marriage in a thoughtful way that honored Lucia's values and their shared journey, rather than being ostentatious or focused on expensive gestures. He proposed at her parents' home during a family gathering, asking not just Lucia, but also her parents and Diego for their blessing and support, acknowledging that he was asking to become part of their family rather than expecting Lucia to leave her family behind and join his solitary, wealthy existence. The wedding was a celebration that brought together Eduardo's business world and Lucia's community and family in ways that some of Eduardo's former associates found uncomfortably democratic and informal, but that felt perfect to the couple themselves, honoring both their pasts and their hopes for a shared future built on values of genuine human connection and mutual support, and using wealth and resources to create positive impact rather than just accumulating more for its own sake. Today, 3 years after that August morning when Eduardo first met Lucia and dismissed her as just another driver who had inconveniently replaced his previous employee, they are married and expecting their first child and building a life together that neither could have imagined when they first met. Eduardo has maintained his business success, but has completely transformed his approach and priorities, now known in the industry as someone who genuinely cares about community impact and affordable housing and ethical business practices rather than just profit maximization at any cost. Lucia has risen to become Chief Financial Officer of Eduardo's company and is recognized in the industry as a brilliant strategic thinker who brings both financial expertise and social consciousness to complex development decisions. Diego has remained cancer-free and is now in college studying medicine, with dreams of becoming an oncologist to help other young people facing the disease that nearly claimed his life, supported by a scholarship fund that Eduardo established specifically to help family members of cancer patients pursue higher education. The deeper truth of this story isn't really about romance or class differences or even about personal transformation, though all those elements are certainly present and important. The real lesson is about the blindness that often comes with privilege and success, the way that wealth and power can insulate us from seeing and understanding the full humanity of people we interact with daily, but don't consider our equals or peers, the opportunities we miss for genuine connection and growth when we treat other people as functions rather than as complete complex human beings worthy of respect and curiosity, regardless of their job title or social status. Eduardo could have continued his entire life living in his expensive isolation and treating Lucia and thousands of other service providers as invisible instruments rather than people, and he would have continued being materially successful while remaining emotionally and spiritually impoverished in ways he didn't fully understand until someone had the courage to push back and assert their dignity, and then subsequently someone had the misfortune to get sick, which created circumstances that forced Eduardo's awareness beyond his comfortable bubble. This story reminds us that we all have blind spots created by our own circumstances and privileges, that the people serving us in various capacities, whether as drivers or cleaners or waiters or cashiers or any other service role, are complete human beings with rich interior lives and dreams and struggles and capabilities that we might never discover if we don't bother to treat them with basic respect and curiosity. It teaches us that true strength and character are often found in people dealing with difficult circumstances with grace and perseverance, rather than in people who have had relatively easy paths to success and mistake their luck and advantages for pure merit. It shows us that human connection and authentic relationship based on mutual respect, rather than hierarchy or transaction, are fundamental needs that money and status can never satisfy, no matter how much we accumulate. Most importantly, it illustrates that it's never too late to recognize our own blindness and limitations, to open our eyes and hearts to people and realities we've been ignoring or dismissing, to use whatever privilege and resources we have to create positive impact rather than just accumulating more for ourselves, and to build genuine relationships based on who people actually are, rather than what function they serve in our lives. If this story resonated with you and made you think about how you see and treat people in service positions or anyone whose social status is different from your own, please leave a like on this video so I know this kind of content that challenges our assumptions and prejudices is valuable to you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about unexpected connections between people from different worlds, about personal transformation and growth, about seeing beyond surface appearances and roles to recognize the full humanity in everyone we encounter. And please share in the comments your own experiences with being seen or not seen by others, with discovering unexpected depths in people you initially dismissed or underestimated, with having your eyes open to realities and perspectives you had been blind to due to your own privilege or circumstances, because your stories help all of us examine our own biases and commit to treating every person with the respect and curiosity they deserve as fellow human beings sharing this journey of life.